Hello,
Hello,
everyone.
I'm
I'm
John
John
Ernie.
Ernie.
Welcome you all
Welcome you all from
all
all
around the
around the
world.
world.
It's
It's
morning
morning
time
time
in
in
Hong
Hong
Kong.
Kong.
We
We
are
are
at
at
the
the
COVID-19
COVID-19
and
and
Beyond
Beyond
Culturally
Culturally
Speaking
Speaking
Conference. We're
conference. We're
starting the
starting the
very
very
first panel. So exciting. So we have three speakers scheduled for this panel. We will start with Professor Michael Berry for now. So just a word, very quick word about Michael. He's Professor of Contemporary Chinese Culture Studies and Director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA. He is a scholar of film studies, especially Chinese film. So he has written numerous books on Chinese cinema. He's also a translator of novels, several novels in fact. And so I will turn the time now to Michael before I introduce the next speaker. So welcome, Professor Michael Berry.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to this very important event. It's really an honor to be here. Of course, at the same time, it's a very solemn event, and I also want to wish all of you out there in the audience that have been experiencing difficult times during the COVID outbreak all of the best. I hope you and your families are healthy and doing okay. And today I'm going to deliver a presentation that's partly based on personal experience as well as academic analysis. And I'm going to take a moment to turn on my PowerPoint, if you bear with me. And my window through the COVID-19 outbreak has very much been intertwined to a book that I translated. And it's a very unique book because it's intricately tied to the COVID outbreak, but also earlier, President Roland Chin, during his opening remarks, talked a lot about how this outbreak is not just about a disease, but it's also a clash of cultures. And it has been fed by all kinds of misunderstandings, social media, fake news. I believe earlier, John also mentioned this kind of crisis of communication. And this is an example, you could look at it almost as a case study where all of these different elements, including the US-China trade war, have been pulled together in a very unique and powerful manner. The book is a diary that's called Wuhan Diary. It was written by a novelist based in Wuhan named Fang Fang. She is a lifelong Wuhan resident, lived there from the age of 2 up until now. Fang Fang was born in 1955. She's generally regarded as probably the single writer in China with the closest ties to Wuhan. When we think of Wuhan writers, Fang Fang is the first name that comes to mind. And so when the outbreak came, earlier this year, she seemed like the unique voice to kind of capture what was happening. And very early in January 25th, she began an online blog or an online diary where she started to document the various things she was seeing, feeling, experiencing. She was, of course, locked down in her apartment. And the diary vacillates between very intimate exposure of her emotional state and what she's going through, to retelling phone conversations and chats that she has with doctor friends about the real nuts and bolts information about what this virus is, how is it transferred, because you have to realize at this time, late January, people are still very much in the dark and trying to understand what this virus really is. And so a lot of it was trying to understand and also allowing her readers to understand what was happening. There's also mundane details. How do I get dog food in the middle of this crisis when everything is shut down? And then there's also very remarkable passages where she releases a kind of outcry where she asks, who's accountable for this? Who screwed up early on? And of course, I should say, certainly there were missteps early on, the first 20 days or so, and Fang Fang's very concerned with those during portions of the diary and wants to hold leaders accountable. At the same time, I do want to make it very clear that I think worldwide, many countries have had many missteps. Where I'm based here in the United States, where I think for the last 6 months, all we've seen is one misstep after another. And so this is certainly a universal issue, but Fang Fang called for accountability. And that was, in some sense, a call that brought a lot of attention to the diary, but also made things very, very complicated. Eventually, this diary would spark a nationwide debate, a very heated political debate. And there needed to be some preconditions for such a debate to take root. And the preconditions include a massive readership. She had at one point more than 50 million readers that were coming to this diary online every night for solace, for information, almost to visit Fang Fang like she was an old friend. And then there were these calls for accountability, of course, which I mentioned, which did make things a bit more complicated. And a very important precondition was that Fang Fang is a writer that has a history of being attacked by ultra-leftist groups starting in 2017. When I say ultra-leftist, that refers to kind of ultra-nationalist groups, in some ways similar to the alt-right in America. And these groups began attacking her in 2017. And so there was already a base that had Fang Fang as a target. And this group was immediately kind of re-enlivened and went on the attack against her. And what happened was an unprecedented level of cyber attacks, and it was waged on many different levels. Now, what were the attacks focused on? There's a couple of different things. One is the fact that she's sitting in her apartment. She's not a frontline medical worker. She's not a nurse. And so the attackers are claiming that everything is hearsay, secondhand accounts. It's not able to be authenticated. They also attacked her for lacking what they claim to be authenticity. And then eventually, as the attacks grew, it got pulled into a whole series of very complex conspiracy theories concerning the US, the origins of the virus, political motivations, many of which had nothing to do with Fang Fang's actual text, but it somehow got pulled into these secondary debates, attacks. And then, of course, there were also personal attacks, exposés about the author's finances or property holdings, and trying to label her as a kind of an elitist. At one point, the attacks almost derailed into something similar to what we saw in 1966 with the Cultural Revolution. This is actually an online Cultural Revolution era style propaganda poster against Fang Fang that says "打倒帝国主义走狗，卖国贼 Fang Fang," down with the imperialist running dog and traitor to the country Fang Fang. And so these types of images started to circulate online. And they circulated in many different fashions. There were social media attacks, there were personal death threats. As the whole thing started to go off the rails, I got pulled into it as the translator. Even I received threats and viral attacks. And there was even a kind of witch hunt whereby other people associated with Fang Fang and the book were attacked. Eventually, there was also a disinformation campaign that was employed around the book, whereby all kinds of stories that were completely fabricated started to spread virally all over the internet. There was also the silencing of many stories and individuals that tried to defend Fang Fang on the internet. Posts were taken down. I gave interviews trying to defend Fang Fang that were taken down within hours of being uploaded. And then you even had uncanny moments, such as when the story of Fang Fang and the diary gets pulled into pop culture and then gets tried to be displaced by an inundation of official official narratives. And I'll show you some of those. These are just a few images of some of the anti-Fang Fang publications. I mean, we moved at warp speed in producing the book. I translated it starting on February 25th. It began about 1 month after Fang Fang began writing. I was translating about 5,000 words a day, working 7 days a week. And we ended up publishing the ebook and audiobook on May 15th. But even before that, in April, you start getting full-length academic style books that are kind of critical treatises against Fang Fang, such as Wuhan Diary. You also get big character posters posted very close to Fang Fang's home. These are the type of posters that you would see during the Cultural Revolution, kind of personal denunciations and threats of physical harm. You even get these kind of things. This is an anti-Fang Fang rap video where they took a Jay-Z and Alicia Keys duet and redubbed it with anti-Fang Fang lyrics. So here's Jay-Z saying, "I'm talking about that old lady, her name is Fang Fang." And there was actually a whole series of what they call diss songs made in a kind of pop music genre or rap genre that were all meant to appeal to a younger audience, but discredit Fang Fang. you get political art like this, this digital art and the propaganda poster I saw you later. And so you see on a multitude of different levels, this attack is playing out. And to show you how deep the witch hunt element went, this is a group on WeChat, which actually called themselves the Little Red Soldiers. And this is a post that says, who will be next? And the who next here is referring to who will be attacked next. It says, we'll keep an eye on Fang Fang's circle of friends to find out. And again, this is a kind of tactic of terror to silence those who might be supporting Fang Fang. And so I want to step back now and ask why? Why would there be such an multi-layered attempt to discredit and attack this writer who was writing a book which I've always felt is really at its core a love letter to Wuhan, a love letter to her city that was really in a state of crisis. And I think this is what's at stake. On the one hand, it's who gets to control the narrative about the outbreak. As we know from modern Chinese history, starting in 1942 with Mao Zedong's Yan'an Talks on Art and Literature was supposed to serve very clear, practical, political motives. Xi Jinping kind of revisited some of that in 2014 when he called his own summit meeting with artists and intellectuals. And it's very important about how the story gets told. Fang Fang's diary may have started off telling the right story, but eventually she started delving into areas that were somewhat controversial. There's also the issue of accountability. She repeatedly calls for those people who dropped the ball, who mishandled the outbreak early on, to stand up, apologize, and resign, to take responsibility for their actions. A call which I think, for me here in the United States, is equally, if not more powerful for my political situation and probably many others all over the world. I think a lot of people have dropped the ball globally. But in China, at least, that was seen as particularly threatening. And then you see these 3, 4, and 5 I put asterisks next to. That's because those are issues that Fang Fang never addresses in this diary. They are never mentioned, which is the issue of international reparations, which started to hit headlines that various countries might seek reparations against China, the origin of the virus, and there's all kinds of conspiracy theories regarding that, and of course, the mounting US-China political tensions. So Fang Fang does not address these at all. However, in the controversy surrounding the book gets pulled into all of these controversies in very complex ways, and often gets projected into that framework in a way that really swept up the nation. And finally, the book ties into much larger debates about civil society in China. And I've gotten messages from friends, from strangers who have told me they've stopped talking to members of their family because of this book. They've disowned or sworn off friends because of this book, because it taps into what kind of society do we want? A society where a writer documenting what she's seeing through a diary is going to be attacked like this, or where we shut ourselves up and kind of serve the better interests of the state. And a lot of people had a really difficult time navigating this issue. And those are some of the reasons why the novel blew up so much. And the result of a lot of this is that you start to see this bifurcation of the Wuhan Diary narrative. So in the West, it gets lauded as this incredibly brave and powerful testament to what happened in Wuhan. It got incredible reviews across the board, whereas in China, at least in a lot of official media, you see all kinds of attacks and more critical perspective through which the book has been viewed. You can even see this if you go to Amazon US. The customer ratings, they are completely split between 5 and 1 stars. And the 1 stars are the trolls who are trying to kind of break the legs of this book. You can also see it in the physical manifestation of what Wuhan Diary means internationally. So there's all these different foreign language editions that have been released in this case, Turkish, Germany, Italy, the Japanese edition. There's going to be about 20 editions that are either published or about to be published. However, within China, the first you see here, Guojing's, is actually not available in China. That's a Taiwan edition, but all these others, Wuhan Diary of Resisting the Outbreak, Wuhan Diary 2020, the Diary of the Battle Against the Virus, the Angel's Diary, Wuhan Diary of the Battle of the Wuhan Outbreak, all of these are filling up the space of the absence of the diary within China, where it's been knocked down or it's not available. There is no book version of the diary available in mainland China, but instead you have a multitude of so-called official narratives that have risen up to take its place and to tell the good story, the proper story about what really happened. Now, I know my time is short, so I'm going to try to come to a conclusion by kind of reflecting on what are some of the lessons that we can learn from Fang Fang. I think that earlier it was mentioned that pandemics teach, and for me, Fang Fang has also taught me quite a bit. In some ways, I'm someone who, as a graduate student, was in New York City during 9/11. I've seen some things in my life, but I don't think I've been through a single historical moment that has been so transformative on so many levels. And a lot of that has to do with my experience and interface through the lens of Fang Fang. One here is compliance with healthcare protocols. Fang Fang started wearing a face mask in the diary as early as, I believe, January 18th. That's before there was even an official announcement that there was an outbreak. It's before anything was official, or maybe, I'm sorry, maybe it was even earlier than that. I'm not gonna, don't quote me on the date, but it was very, very early on. She's already wearing a face mask. This is when there were rumors that there was a SARS-like virus. Whereas here, where I'm stationed in the United States, 6, 7 months in, people are still very much debating the efficacy of face masks. Two, the essential role that citizens have to hold government and political leaders accountable for missteps in conjunction with the coronavirus. And again, Fang Fang was writing about those first 20 days in Wuhan. For me, the real question is here in the US and various European countries, places all over the world where we have seen terrible outbreaks which have been directly fed by ineffective leadership. Who's holding those leaders accountable? And for me, Fang Fang provides an incredibly powerful model of a single citizen that's able to stand up and cut through all the noise and really become a lightning rod for activism and for engagement with how we look at these types of issues. So part of that is this courage to speak out. And I think that's something that's so essential for all of us, the importance for all of us to tell our own stories. And of course, as a literary and film scholar, it's all too often that people look at literary and cinematic works as frivolous works of escapism and lacking social engagement. But here was a work, a diary, that really grabbed the imagination of the entire nation, in some ways the world. And it's a work that many people have fought about, and it's still very much contested, but it shows the power to bear witness, to shape the world, to impact change. And Fang Fang, for me, I just can say on a personal level, has just been such a model of courage and bravery throughout this entire pandemic. And so this is just a very cursory overview of Wuhan Diary and how a testimony to the outbreak can also go viral and also wreak all kinds of existential questions, including death threats, including our place in this, and it really unleashed a firestorm of controversy. And so I look forward to discussing this more with you during our conversation period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yes. Thank you for bringing this story to us as we start. The theme I forgot to mention of this particular session is called Death and Survival, the Existential Dimensions. So I think the story that you just told us and your analysis very much address some of the difficulties about how one tells this kind of story with grave consequences. Now, let me remind the audience who have joined us here that we will have a question, interaction, and conversation time after we have another speaker speak. So you, to do so, you just simply use the chat function later on. What I'll do is later on is that, once I see questions in the chat room, either you type out the question or not, I'll call on you in order. So without further ado, let me just introduce our next speaker. And that's Dr. Harry Wu. Michael is in LA, but Harry is right here in Hong Kong. And so Dr. Harry Wu is the Director and Assistant Professor of Medical Ethics and the Humanities Unit at the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Hong Kong. He's a medical humanities scholar, a historian, but he was also trained as a physician and worked briefly in psychiatry. Let me just read out his recently published book. It's called Mad by the Millions, Mental Disorders and the Early Years of the World Health Organization. That was published by the MIT Press. The book will be coming out very soon. I think maybe Harry can tell you much more about it. So time over to you, Harry.
Okay, thank you, John, for your kind introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to join this exciting panel. I'm grateful for the conference to create this opportunity for me to reflect on a number of things that I haven't thought through carefully in the past few months. So I'm a historian of medicine, but today I'm speaking by wearing another hat. I'm an educator of medical humanities. And my role in the unit is coordinating humanities teaching and learning activities for medical students. And medical humanities at Hong Kong U is a mandatory program. Students have to take it for across the 6 years during their journey of becoming a doctor. It is not a difficult program, and we argue that attendance, being there is the most important factor influencing their overall achievement in this course. And however, during COVID-19 pandemic, with a lot of teachings and learning activities are suspended or crammed, and then our program also suffers. It becomes actually the first to be sacrificed to fit the hustle of the new calendar. And actually this reflects the reality in the society as a whole. When we face a crisis that people prioritize certain areas of interest and at the same time sacrificing others. So this problem is just the tip of an iceberg and related to what I'm going to talk about today, right? So my brief talk will be related to some lived experiences in Hong Kong. And this panel is, of course, about how death and dying is reshaped by COVID-19 and how they are related to the question of existence. And in the abstract, I mentioned that I want to do 3 things. First, I'm going to talk about health problem instead of diseases. Second, I'm calling for emergent cross-disciplinary responses to current crisis. And then I'm going to briefly introduce the logic of care as our pressing need for problem solving. And so I'm going to walk you through some these points with stories. The first one, well, it's simply just my teaching scenario. Our face-to-face tutorials of medical humanities are very rare chances for students who reflect on the gap between what they learned at school and what actually they can see in the hospital, in the work culture, real work culture. It unfortunately becomes virtual. And some students initially shared with me, so at the very beginning of COVID-19, they immediately observed that something has gone wrong. They were doing clerkship in the hospital and they found that the attitude of a few professors, their teachers, suddenly changed. Originally, they were very nice, patient, and caring individuals, but overnight they became different. So it is kind of natural to assume that facing something that is uncertain and something that is threatening to their life, they became ill-tempered and impatient because of anxiety. So I took the chance to ask students what they thought about the change. So, well, actually in my program, we always want to create safe and non-judgmental environment for students to reflect on things that they feel bewildered and sometimes confused about in the awkward setting, clinical setting, when they first walk into the real real clinical setting. So this is so-called the moral dilemma. Young physicians they may confront when they are first thrown into so-called the real world. And during COVID, by shrinking the contact hours with students, we have already missed a lot of opportunities to discuss these agenda. And a lot of these problems in the real world are structural problems. And they are not easy to talk about unless we invest time, we have the space, and we want to dedicate ourselves in talking about all these. Right, so first, this is just first reflection. Now, what is health problem then? Right, it emphasizes that in an illness scenario, that we don't really look at disease itself. In illness narrative, this concept is very important because it takes perspectives of various stakeholders, even if they are in the same scenario. For example, like stroke, hypertension, genetic deficits, diabetes, they all mean very differently for different stakeholders like physicians, patients, families, social workers, policymakers, even insurance companies. And this crisis we're currently facing is not just the abrupt appearance of an unknown virus. This actually reflects the chronicized ill condition of the society. So another scenario that I chatted with students about was healthcare workers' strike. Like many other parts in the world, that doctors in Hong Kong, when they first realized that there was something going wrong and something that might paralyze their capacity of care, the first reaction among them was the reminiscence of SARS experience in 2003. And during that year, many patients died, including healthcare workers in Hong Kong, and the number was top of the world. What they did in the first instance, when the situation hasn't gone really bad and hasn't been declared as a pandemic, they were very vigilant. So in the beginning of February, they waged 5 consecutive days of strike to urge the government to take necessary action, because they did not want what happened in 2003 to repeat. But the union's action was painted by the Chinese state media as these doctors were immoral. They forgot their duty to provide direct care to patients, and their actions were more poisonous than the virus itself, right? But for the health workers in Hong Kong, the industrial action was taken as a moral behavior, actually. The strike was waged for longer-term benefit of the city. And actually, so you can see the controversy here. And the government, in the end, did partially seal the border, despite the fact that they denied the strike had a direct impact. Now, if we dig deeper, we can find that the relationship in the city among health professionals, government, and people nowadays has become shattered. It has become more and more impossible for the government to do the right thing and for healthcare professionals to push any agenda. So like many other parts in the world, people doubt that policy is led by science. It's quite interesting to see that in this world, a lot of so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions are actually very similar. But people comply with these policies. How people comply with these policies are quite different. And we can see the ways in which, for example, like epidemiologists, they predict the situation of pandemic. The ways are, the numbers, the way they forecast the numbers are similar, but the way how they are interpreted are very different. So it is just too naive to assume that we're practicing this pure science. So this is a very crucial time for us to look at the context regarding how these numbers can have an impact, and based on what level of trust as the foundation of health governing. These numbers are meaningful, not only to health administrators, but also for the public. And in the case of Hong Kong, scientists and administrators have they have done a lot of effort, but they haven't been aware of how the society operates. They fail to recognize how much trust they could have won from citizens, especially after the whole year of political turmoil in Hong Kong. Another scenario. We know that, for example, like in Singapore, originally people thought that the control of pandemic went quite well until that there was a surge of confirmed cases in the dormitories of immigrant workers, right? And that shows people were quite oblivious about the fact that people who provided essential work in a so-called international city, they did not receive essential care until it became a problem. And things in Hong Kong were not that serious. But we can also see that when domestic workers got infected, They do not get any support from the government. Employers, they are asked to pay up the cost of treatment and necessary quarantine or hospital admission. And this is a loophole that did not receive enough attention before the crisis emerged. In the case of Hong Kong, more serious problems emerged not among immigrant workers, but here, during the third wave of epidemic, emerging in early July, and also the entire month of August. Most of the serious cases of COVID-19 began to appear in old age care homes. This is not quite unique to Hong Kong, but compared with a relatively well-controlled in this area, it reflects the reality that a significant proportion of elderlies in Hong Kong have to spend their remaining life after decades of hard working in these old age care homes. And like many other stories we have already heard, family members are not allowed to, for example, they say goodbye to their beloved in person in institutions. They have to rely on technologies like smartphones to communicate with those they originally already had little time for a short visit in their busy life. And so this is a very bizarre picture in a cosmopolitan city. In some part of the city, young people have to work for 18 hours a day. And in some other part of the city, death numbers, for example, like in Shanghai, right, death numbers are more than twice the actual number of registered residents in 1 year. Right? Now, people around the world are not unfamiliar with the debate of legitimacy of lockdown policy. And in Hong Kong, there was a peculiar case. The government was trying everything to flatten the curve, of course. But one of the policies was banning people to have lunch in outdoor areas. And the government, in the end, received extensive criticism. And that order had to stop after 1 day because the policy left a significant number of essential workers eating in heavy rain. And the government said that they were not aware that there were so many people that they have to work. They can't work from home at all. It shows how out of touch the elitism-oriented authority was. So this is another loophole regarding the care chain in the city, which definitely needs to be critically reviewed. So these health problems are not diseases. They were long-term, chronicized crises that already existed for a very, very long time. And they did not surface, or the scale of these problems did not become so big until the crunch time of COVID-19. And in my medical humanities program, I have tried to invite sufferers for different chronic diseases, like caregivers of mentally challenged or those who are recovering from stroke. So I invite these people to share with students the scenarios of their daily life, their daily suffering. And these narratives are important for our students to learn that the fact that their role has shifted from interveners to caregivers, sometimes no difference from their families or even domestic workers, right? Okay, now, here, the authorities out-of-touch approach is one thing. The unique kind of professionalism that pursues technical fix is another one. Previously, I mentioned that the government might not really rely on professional opinions in health governing. But the bigger problem is that even if it does, the professional opinions might not be able to probe into real problems on the ground. For example, in Hong Kong, before COVID became rampant, the society has been extremely concerned about influenza that exhausted hospitals' care capacity every year. And a lot of professionals' opinions on the attitude of these anti-vaxxers in the city was, it is pure stupidity. But when I was recruiting, for example, these caregivers of mentally challenged individuals to share their stories with students, I encountered several people, for example, like parents of autistic children, who are actually very highly educated, middle-income individuals, but they also genuinely believed that their children's condition was caused by MMR vaccine, which was, in our professional understanding, it's already scientifically proved a hoax. But oftentimes we really fail to explore. We might be more observant that these patients, no, parents' stupidity, could it be just a choice made without other choice to shift their responsibility of their children's care from themselves to a non-living thing as a scapegoat? So this is why I want to call for emergent cross-disciplinary responses to critically assess our complex societies and all the narratives that are hidden on the surface that we see in the media. Today in Hong Kong, health could have been co-defined by all stakeholders, but unfortunately it has become, or it has remained, an uncompromising slogan. Just I want to quote something. In late August, there was an editorial in the Lancet, the medical journal, saying, quote, "The boundaries of health research systems should be a blurred one. We need to appreciate contextual figures such as history, politics, and economics," end of quote. So teaching medical humanities for 5 years in Hong Kong, we still only see people think and practice in silos, and people don't collaborate at all. And actually in Asia, from my observation, scientific professions sometimes become useless also because of how professionalism is treated. Recently, a medical sociologist, Harry Collins, he made a call to explore how democracy needs science and vice versa. And he said that our professions have become more managerial, and within scientific profession, the ideas of autonomy and personal responsibility are used to retain some degree of market power. But at the same time, within these organizations, people are trying hard to create normative expectations of duty and responsibility. And this kind of marketized professionalism becomes more commercially aware, budget-focused, and entrepreneurial. And it undermines the idea of profession as a repository of moral standards. So in the two top universities that I work with, they are the best examples of this kind of practice. Numerous metrics are created to measure your performance. Activities to engage with the society are discouraged. So it's not only harmful to knowledge itself, but also to how knowledge can be employed to solve problems. So now I don't have much time. I don't think I have enough time to elaborate what the logic of care should be like in rethinking the role and function of medical humanities. But a very simple point I want to make is that medical humanities as a concept or discipline was created to critique the overly biologically determined and technical approach to health problems. So the logic of care, it was raised in opposition to the logic of choice in modern medicine. Instead of offering a handful of treatment plans for patients to choose, the logic of care emphasizes on the continuity and flexibility of care as a moral enterprise. To be able to do what we really need to, to be able to do that, we really need to critically and engagingly review the social cultural determination of health. And social cultural determination of health shouldn't just be a plethora that people think is important. This is still a huge gap in clinical and pedagogical teaching setting. Now, we still can observe that in medical schools, instructors do not know how to teach it when it comes to root cause analysis. So it is time for us to rethink how medical humanities to reposition itself and how it should exist in what format to influence clinical medicine and further understand the landscape of living and dying. And now, when the freedom of expression in Hong Kong and perhaps in other parts of the world, due to political situation, we are facing a fiercer reality are we still able to continue bringing all these agenda, these inconvenient truths to talk about on the table? Right? So this is something, a final question I throw out. I'll stop here and leave some time for question and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. The participants, the audience to our panel, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you see a Q&A button. So this is where you can pose a question, and as moderator, I'll go ahead and talk about these questions and raise them for the speakers. In fact, we have a first question coming in. So this is a question for Michael. Right? I hope that we can be more interactive later on. Maybe Michael can ask Harry a question and vice versa and all that. But there's a question for Michael, which says here, for your translation for such an important piece of writing, right? Thank you. But I was wondering if you're familiar with another famous Wuhan-based female writer. Her name is Zhi Li. Zhi Li. She has also has an experience as an epidemic doctor who reflects on her previous novels. Yet, if you've read what Zhi Li has written during and after the Wuhan lockdown, you will see the huge different ways of reacting to this historical tragedy between these two writers. This person who asked the question also mentioned that Zhi Li had been totally silent on Fang Fang's diary. Any thoughts, Michael?
So I'm well aware of Zhi Li as a writer. In fact, that's coincidence. These are right next to me on the bookshelf. These happen to be some of Zhi Li's work. So I'm a fan of her writing for many years. However, I have not read her documentation of Wuhan Diary. I've read the work of many other writers. I've looked at Guo Jing's diary. I've looked at some excerpts of Ai Xiaoming's diary, a lot of just average citizens who have put their testimonies online. But I have not seen Zhi Li, so I will definitely look for that. But one of the reasons that I selected to translate Fang Fang's diary was, part of it was simply the fact that I had a working relationship with Fang Fang because I was translating one of her earlier works, a novel called Soft Burial. And I was actually actively engaged in that project when I noticed her blog about the outbreak. And it felt so vitally important and of the moment, kind of capturing the zeitgeist of what was in the air and what you could feel was to come globally. And I just suggested to Fang Fang, why don't we put aside the novel and I just work on this diary? And so that's why her novel came to my attention so early. And she actually didn't even tell me she was writing it. I just happened to discover it after a friend introduced it to me. But it just felt so just devastatingly important. And I've never worked so fervently on a project in my career, just day and night, because it really felt like that story needed to get told and get out to the world. But there are, of course, one of the things Fang Fang advocates for in her diary is for everyone to be a witness, for everyone to write down what you're feeling and experiencing during this very unique time and post them, publish them. And I think it's crucial that truth doesn't come through one person's gaze, but it comes from a pastiche of different perspectives and different testimonies. And we look at all of that, and somehow by filtering through it, we get some semblance of what that truth might really be. And so Fang Fang, of course, is just one component, but I'm also eager to read Zhi Li and many other writers. Thank you for the question.
Can I also respond to this question as well?
Please.
Right, okay. This is a very interesting question. Actually, I remember when I was a student, I read Hu Fayun's RuYianSARS.com that was written sometime after SARS. And then it existed as a fiction form, right? And there were not so many accounts as such during that period of time, but during COVID-19, there are so many diaries coming out as private voices trying to bear witness of this pandemic. And so I see that on the ground in the society, there's a rosy change that the civil society is growing, and these private voices are much needed And then, well, it really makes me think of a bizarre moment that, like in Hong Kong, I can't remember on what day, that there was a state-initiated mourning, right, to the deceased because of COVID-19. And then so just outside of my window, the Queen Mary Hospital, the national flag was flying half-mast. And this is actually a kind of public mourning. And then we don't actually see private voices being documented in Hong Kong. So this is very bizarre. So I think this is, you kind of raised a great trigger point for us to think about that where these voices are, these narratives are in terms of how we can bear witness and we can critically look at what's happening in the society. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and maybe if I could just add one more very quick follow-up, which is one of the things that sets Fang Fang apart from Chi Li and all the other writers, is Fang Fang is the text that generated the massive amount of controversy, of debate. It really was the lightning rod. And so even whether you agree with what she wrote or didn't agree with what she wrote, it's a cultural document that really is almost a historical record of a very unique moment in Chinese cultural space, whereby so many people were kind of torn apart by these different ideas that were being debated so fervently.
There's another question here and this one is for Harry. Let me read it out. Trying to figure out. This is from Maria Bautista. She says, logic of care being swarmed by the logic of choice. That's an interesting idea, she's thought. However, given the seeming urgency of the response to the pandemic, things are just crazy, right? And given Hong Kong's SARS experience from 17 years ago. So her question was, I wonder where all the pandemic preparedness initiatives from WHO and rolled out in countries have not anticipated any of these. Choices should have been made and care followed. Was care blind to choices given shifting mutations of virus and societal responses? So I guess just maybe asking you to think, talk a bit more about the tension between these two kinds of logics, perhaps, if you will.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a great question, actually. Logic of care was first raised by a medical anthropologist. Her name is Anne Marimore. And then she is a physician, of course, and then she actually juxtaposed these two kinds of notions, logic of care and logic of choice, by looking at people who have cardiovascular diseases and what kind of, for example, like screening tests and treatments and drugs that they can take as choice, right, in terms of treatment and care, right? And then so what she fails to elaborate in her book was that she doesn't know whether or not this can be applied onto a public health level, right? So in terms of public health level, it's the community we are dealing with. So maybe at this point, choice should come in first. But what I'm talking about is at the stage of preparing the society to face a incoming crisis, that this kind of concept should exist. And then, right, so that we can better facilitate ourselves in facing something more uncertain. We need the care in a broad sense. It's not just hospital care or disease care. For example, like whether or not we have universal health coverage, we provide support for example, like domestic workers in Hong Kong, immigrant workers in Hong Kong. This kind of really care in the broad sense. So we need to focus on the continuity, flexibility in terms of when it comes to crisis, we can better respond. Thank you.
Okay. To follow up, Harry, there's another question for you, and then another question for Michael. So I'll take it in order. So the next question is again for Harry, from
Albert Chow. He said he agreed a lot
John, your microphone is muted.
May I ask the technician not to unmute me for the rest of this session? Okay, thank you. Let me start again. Sorry about that. So, question from Dr. Albert Chow, who agrees with your observation and understands your frustration. His first question was that during the strike of the medical professionals, the nurses and the doctors early on in Hong Kong and during the pandemic, there were patients whose medical care was delayed. So who can decide the medical care should be delayed for the bigger and longer term good of the community? So I think the second question he has, which I'll read to you, is related, right? So he says that, I think fighting the pandemic is never just science. There are demonstrations against lockdown around the world, etc., etc. How do we balance personal freedoms and public good under such extreme conditions? Very good questions. I think these also are questions that relate to, ideas about, I mean, I know your focus is on this personal, more private kind of dimensions, the existential dimensions, but these are inevitably linked to these other questions about public good, right? Harry, any thought?
Right, thank you, Professor Chow. Oh, this is so difficult to answer, actually. I mean, for historically, a lot of health workers' strike are only conducted for one day, and then in exchange of, for example, like a longer term benefit for the community. But in Hong Kong, it was unique. It was waged for 5 consecutive days, and then the union was asking for another, but it actually failed. Right? And then but actually, what the union promised to the community, I mean to the public, was that they did not want to close down emergent services. That means that so medical care is not delayed for those who are in pressing need, right? So actually we don't know what's happening on the ground. Well, I'm not a frontline clinicians in the hospital, so a lot of these says broadcasted through media that the hospital authority, they actually, well, condemned the industrial action, saying that, okay, so some medical care was delayed, but actually we don't know because this is in the official media, right? And then so to balance, well, these personal freedoms and public good under extreme conditions, of course, in public health, personal freedoms are definitely there to be sacrificed, right? But to balance the two, well, there are so many different factors that should be considered and taken seriously, and it should be, there's no standard, I think. And actually, I'm not an ethicist, but what I'm teaching, the principle I abide by is to really to want students to think in context and out of the box. That means that we, in making things balance, there's no golden rule, and you just need to plan contingently according to context, right? To consider in every step, considering whether or not we are doing good to what people and what level, what size of population we are taking care of, and sacrificing the right or freedom or benefit of what people we are also dealing with, right? Yeah, so this is a very difficult question we can together think through.
Indeed, this might be one of the biggest lessons, is to find a balance at all levels, from the most intimate personal level to the macro level. I think that's so hard to strike in many ways. Michael, you're able to see the question, the next question for you, right?
Yes. Okay,
so can you talk about whether this kind of attack that you mentioned was organized? Who organized this sort of thing, do you think?
Yeah, so it's difficult to say because as we know, these online attacks, there are thousands of trolls that are mobilized. Some might not even be humans, they might be bots. Sometimes it's really difficult to tell who, and a lot of the accounts, the Weibo accounts where the attacks originated from are new accounts with very few, very little history. A lot of them, people created accounts specifically to attack me and attack Fang Fang. So I would get messages from people with accounts called things like, America will die or Fang Fang will go to jail, and people would actually create accounts under these types of names. There were a few very high profile Weibo users with 8 or 9 million followers that were also attacking Fang Fang. I think we can trace the origin of the attacks to the ultra leftist groups that began attacking Fang Fang in 2017. That's where it began. Those same couple of accounts, the same groups. However, it very quickly grew, it escalated, and like I said, there was disinformation campaign, there was mockumentaries, there were all kinds of ways in which multiple avenues were employed. So it was a sophisticated disinformation campaign that was launched. Now, one thing we do know that in China, there's very tight control of the internet. And so we all know there's many keywords that are banned. And so for an attack of this scale to be launched and to continue unstopped for more than 6 months, it's very, very much unprecedented. You don't see literary campaigns against a writer lasting for 5 or 6 months. We know that at least someone at the very least was looking the other way or allowing this to take place. As for the origins of who masterminded it, that I will leave our viewers to ponder.
Yeah, we don't want another conspiracy now, right? There's already too many, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Let me continue to encourage our audience from around the world to ask questions and join in this lively conversation. Michael, just a point of just following up with you, trying to stay at the kind of human level, which is the theme of this panel, right?
Yes.
So you said you know Fang Fang in person, and all of this. Can you tell us a bit more about what she's going through herself, and how is she doing these days? Do you have any contact with her?
Yeah, we exchange texts almost on a daily basis. Especially from the period of late February through June, we were in very, very close contact. And it's been, I'm sure, very trying and difficult for her as she's locked down. I remember my heart kind of breaking that seeing that before the epidemic came to us in Los Angeles, of course, she was in the midst of this very terrible outbreak, and there's a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of unknowns, and she's doing her best to kind of provide a reservoir of care, of support, of, in some cases, speaking up for people who needed a voice. And to see the level of attacks that were being waged against her, for me, was really heartbreaking. And I always consider myself, I like to think I'm empathetic and could put myself in her shoes, but until the attacks came to me, which was in early April, and I started getting thousands of attacks and threats, I can say that unless you experience it, you really have no way to really appreciate what that is like. And even what I did experience was a small fraction of what Fang Fang was experiencing. And of course, I was in the rather sheltered space of Los Angeles. She's there in Wuhan. There were people posting, the denunciation posters right outside where she lives. And it was almost a kind of campaign of terror against her. But I have never seen any individual stand up to that kind of harassment with such audacity, courage, bravery, the way she would speak up against them, to speak truth to power, it was, for me, that was probably one of the most inspirational moments of this experience, was seeing what she could do when put in that position. When I don't think I know anyone in my circle of friends and among my colleagues that would have been able to withstand the kind of pressure that she was under and has been under for so many months. And so in many ways, it just taught me it's led me to ask very fundamental questions, that during this outbreak, during this very terrible time, what's my role going to be? What's my contribution going to be? How can I help and stand up and make things better? And I think earlier I mentioned how it had changed me. These are some of the ways that it's changed me. And but Fang Fang just has my utmost respect, and I'll stop here.
So far, I haven't heard you use the word hero or anything like this, which somebody might expect people to use this kind of language to describe somebody being attacked and all of that. Maybe I'll come back with that question later on. There's a question for Harry, asking you about doctor-patient relationship. How do you think? I think this is really a very good kind of grounded question. Also, how would that kind of thing be transformed, given what we're going through? Harry?
Thank you. I'm so excited that there is a student asking a question. And will the pandemic worsen doctor-patient relationship in Hong Kong? Not necessarily. If doctors and physicians, they both understand what they are facing and that they have mutual understanding. And we know that this is a transient thing, right? In terms of people becoming anxious, people have bad temper, right? But is there an opportunity to improve doctor-patient relationship in Hong Kong? Then this is a huge question that I've met people in Hong Kong during lunch and dinner with, for example, like movie directors and these people. There was one documentary maker. Then she was so angry about the attitude of doctors in Hong Kong in general, right? And I was so surprised, right? And then so there is some inconvenient truth that we cannot turn our head away from, is that nowadays in Hong Kong, of course, there are a huge bunch of good doctors, but the education of doctors is a kind of elitism approach. And so a lot of doctors are not really paying attention to what the whole picture of suffering, the scenario looks like, right? So this is actually our purpose of implementing a medical humanities program in medical education. But ironically, right, we see those people, those doctors who have very good manner, who are very kind, they're actually relatively older. They belong to the older generation in Hong Kong. And then in their education, they did not have this kind of medical humanities program at all. Why was that? But that perhaps says something about the modern medical education has gone something wrong, right? So we have to really rethink what our focus really is. And then, I remember that in our medical school, this on YouTube, our dean said to our students, you are creme de la creme, right? Cream on top of the cream of the bunch of school graduates that are admitted to medical school. And I don't think this is true in Hong Kong, but I think we need to gradually change this kind of approach so that we can bring the level between Hong Kong doctors and patients to the same level. Nowadays, the doctor-patient relationship should be a more equal one, and clinical decisions are made in concordance actually between the two, right? So yes, this is a big question, and if you're interested, and join us in the initiative. Right?
A quick question, Harry. I mean, the kind of courses that you and your colleagues in your unit offers apparently isn't required of all medical students.
It is required.
It is required.
It is required for all students, right?
And but that's actually already a good practice.
I think so, right? But the thing is that we have little room to influence the whole faculty. Now, this is because this is not clinicians' problem. This is a structural problem that we need to attract clinicians to support the initiative, to support the program. But actually, there are a lot of barriers still.
Okay, here's a question that it's very sharp. I mean, Jennifer Slack is asking a question for each of you, but I'll take the one for Harry first because we're just talking about it. Now, you can read her question here. Do you consider medical humanities medicine or humanities? Another way to ask, she said, would someone who teaches medical humanities need to be trained in medicine or in humanities?
These are excellent questions, right? Medicine, clinical medicine into 2,000 years ago, it was not medicine, it was not considered clinical medicine or humanities. Actually, for example, in times of Hippocrates, his doctoring, he did not have antibiotics, he did not practice surgery. And then his method was telling stories, right? And so nowadays, medicine has become, we need to really historically answer this question. The medicine only becomes powerful after, well, perhaps 200 or 300 hundreds ago. Well, in the early modern time, people started to find that medical problems can be found on the cell level. It's called a cell turn in medical history, right? So that we know better concerning the deep structure of our body, right? So it becomes scientific, right? But then gradually that we can see that human persons are disappearing from the clinical setting. Nowadays, we don't actually see the patients. We can just see a plain film, the X-ray film. We can draw your blood and then measure your neurotransmitter, and or tumor marker. We know what you are suffering from, but we don't see the human person nowadays. So this is about 20 or 30 years ago. People started to talk about the narrative turn in clinical medicine. And then so medical humanities emerged as a critique to this kind of our conventional way of modern, of practicing in modern medicine. And this is quite ironic. And in my view, I think medical humanities should be a joint initiative, right, between arts and medicine. And then it shouldn't only be taught or trained in, or people who teach medical humanities. It's totally okay if you are trained only in arts or only in medicine, right? Because medicine itself, we really need to rethink what medicine really is. So yeah, thank you. This is an excellent question.
It is a beautiful question because it is something that I think we can talk much more about it. But let me just turn quickly to Michael with the question that Jennifer also asked you, right, about Fang Fang's safety and the larger political consequences.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for the question. So she is safe. She's home, as far as I know, and physically she's okay. However, safety is a relative term, and so although a lot of the detractors, one of the things that they attack her for is say you're kind of a big crybaby, saying how people are attacking you all the time and grow up, you're fine, you're an entitled, former chair of the Hubei Writers Association. And there's this whole discourse of entitlement that they attack her and say that she has nothing to complain about. But I can tell you, the psychological toll of months of constant attacks, death threats, often sexualized death threats, threats of rape, threats of murder, terrible. I mean, really, and the psychological toll and impact that has on an individual over time, I would say is incalculable. I mean, it takes a very strong person to withstand those kind of persistent attacks. And there are real world consequences that have spun out because of this. For instance, earlier in my presentation, I showed you a text from this little red soldier group that said, who's next to be attacked? Who's next to be targeted? Look at Fang Fang's circle of friends. And indeed, that's what happened. Professor Liang Yanping, a professor who had spoken up for Fang Fang, was brought to kind of trial at her university on charges and was eventually banned from teaching and dismissed from the Chinese Communist Party because as a result, it kind of blew up into something much bigger, but it began with her speaking up for Fang Fang. Wang Xiaoni, a very eminent and respected contemporary poet and professor, she was viciously attacked. And there was a whole series of professors that were kind of caught up in this witch hunt. So there are real world consequences for how this played out for many, many individuals. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the psychological and emotional toll as well.
I think some people, may, I guess my question for you, Michael, is, to what extent did some of these attacks totally discredit or ignore any of the literary value of someone who is not just a blogger, but a legitimate established writer? So you can attack because you don't like what she says, but the form in which she writes, can you give us a sense about whether there's any kind of assessment at that level?
Well, you know, it's a unique work. As I mentioned earlier, it's a hybrid that vacillates between very personal thoughts to these calls for accountability to just kind of verbatim accounts of her conversations with doctor friends, with her neighbors. And so it's very different than almost all of Fang Fang's other literary works, which are manicured, they're polished, they are revised, they go through a very long and complex process before they're released to the public. This has its value not in that aesthetic beauty, but in its explosiveness. This was someone of the moment, in the moment, bearing witness and testimony to what she was feeling, seeing, experiencing every day. And that night she was shooting it out to the world, and people all over, at least Chinese speakers all over the world, were reading this, and they were crying with her. They were worrying about her. They were imagining what was it like to be in Wuhan during that moment. They were understanding what the outbreak was like and what would probably come to them in many cities all over the world in the months to come. And so the literary value, of course, of any work is not going to be universally even, right? Some works we value because of their experimentalism, others because of their beauty, others because of their content. This was, for me, a lot of it was the explosiveness. This was of the moment. It spoke to what so many people were going through. But like you are hinting at, a lot of the value of Wuhan Diary was discredited by the trolls, the attacks, the disinformation. And that's really one of the most fascinating aspects of this book. And because it started out as something that was almost universally loved, 50 million readers, people were retweeting and posting and sending to their friends. And she really became the voice of Wuhan for a period of time. And then within the matter of days, literally days, it went from being this work that people were embracing to being a work that was demonized and attacked. And that transference is really something that you rarely see in literary culture, but it's also very much tied to the COVID outbreak, what was happening politically on the political stage between the US and China at that time. But there definitely was a radical transformation in the reception of the book. I will say finally, though, there is also a silent majority that don't dare speak their approval, because if they wade into the waters of Weibo and speak up for Fang Fang, they know what the consequences could be, as we saw with Liang Yanping, as we saw with Wang Xiaoni and so many others. And so that creates a kind of culture of terror whereby people put their head down and stay silent rather than speak up. And so I know personally, I received probably more than 2,000 private texts and emails from writers, just citizens and readers in support of the book and saying, thank you for doing this and ignore the trolls, don't be. And I can't tell you how moved I was by that swell of support and love, that at the same time, a lot of those voices are invisible because they're not making the same statements in public because of the culture of online terror that is kind of raging on Weibo, at least during this period.
But it seems to be, two different worlds colliding, though, wouldn't you think, Michael? I mean, there's the world of the literati, for example, people of a more learned disposition, who might look at it from a more, from a variety of angles and appreciating some of the literary, values or whatever. May not agree with the dramaturgy of it, but
Sure.
But then there's another kind of segment of the voices who attack. Who just discredit all that other stuff. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there are many, many angles, many voices, many factions. There are articles you can find online analyzing the book from linguistics, from legal standpoint, looking at there are statisticians that have written and published articles about her use of different terms and engagement with different themes throughout the diary. And so it's been studied from many different perspectives, and it's, like I said, a lightning rod of controversy, both within China and the way it plays into the antagonism between the US and China. And the reason it plays into that is because once news of the international publication of Wuhan Diary broke, it suddenly became not just a China story, but a global story. And there was a fear on the part of the book's detractors that the book would be used as what they call a weapon or a knife to hurt China or to harm China, which is the last thing that Fang Fang, I, the publisher, any of us intended. And of course, it never came true. The only place where those allegations exist are in the minds of the ultra leftists who are attacking the book. And so it's kind of an internal argument that they've created.
Harry, would you like to raise your question to Michael directly?
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Michael, I'm just when you are talking, I've been curious about the genre of literature, in how they change in China, and that's because, okay, apart from the the difference between fiction and diary forms of narratives, that I've been wondering about how technology would play a role in transforming these, how people communicate, and also have an impact on the genre of literature. And this is because we know that a lot of people, when they were trying to document what's happening on the ground, they use screenshots, right? It seems that there is a whole movement going on in China that people are taking screenshots to document what they've been, what they saw, right? So do you have any thought on that?
No, it's definitely, this kind of digital witnessing is a very important new player in how we're understanding and approaching something like this pandemic. And there's different sides to it, in the sense that on the one hand, it's of the moment, it's immediate, we can all see it globally on the internet, but it also is somewhat ephemeral, because I can't tell you, as I've been writing and thinking about Fang Fang and this whole diary, I've gone back to look at a lot of posts and articles that I read over the last few months, and so many are gone, just erased and you can't find any semblance that they ever existed, which for me as a scholar makes it even more pressing of the need that to bear witness and to create an archive for these voices and these memories that otherwise are just going to be erased. And so there's a precarious side to that digital witnessing as well. There have also been certain archives I've seen that popped up online that are kind of clearinghouses of different people who experienced the outbreak in Wuhan and have posted their diary entries, just everyday people. There was also one of kind of cries for help among people during that crucial 6 weeks at the height of the outbreak, when there was incredible lack of medical availability of hospital beds, and people were pleading and posting on social media, please, my father's dying, he needs to get admitted, no hospitals will take them. And some young netizens created a website with a portal and an archive for all of those voices during that crucial 6 weeks. And those really change kind of our approach and understanding of literature, in terms of how all of this together, whether it's Fang Fang's diary, Shi Li's diary, Zhang Ling, the Chinese-Canadian writer, just published an incredible book of essays about her experience with the coronavirus in China. All of these are part of this very kind of living pastiche of memories that I think, and like I said earlier, I think we need all of that alongside official narratives like CCTV and what I showed you with the Angels in White diaries and the Battle of Wuhan disease diaries, all of those. I think there's a value in those as well. You need to look at the official narratives alongside the non-official narratives, and it's between those that we get some semblance of what the truth may be.
I guess like everything else, when a huge crisis or disaster happens, is when, we have an opportunity to check, how strong or resilient our public sphere can be. I mean, we say we have been modernized, we have, multiple channels of communication and debate and dialogue. But when a crisis happens, that's really a time in which you can say, how well has that been going, really, right?
Yeah, I just want to raise something, just a brief anecdote that I can't remember in what months, that it seems that the state initiative kind of narrative in terms of combating the disease could not really could surpass that of the public sphere. I mean the civil society. They actually published one book, digital book. It's called 大国战役, and then after I don't know how many days, and it was taken off shelf, right? So we can gradually see the change.
We still have 10 minutes before we close this session, so let me encourage more questions from the audience. Yeah, Jennifer responded to the both of you, and thank you for it, because she has a student in Wuhan herself that she's been keeping in touch with, and she will definitely, you know, check out Fang Fang's work and your translation as well, Michael.
Could I just appeal, if we have any, I'm sure Harry would appreciate this too, if we have any undergrads or even grad students, we'd love to hear student questions if you want to contribute.
Indeed, right. There was one from a student earlier, but let's have more if possible. You know, since we're waiting for it, I may just toss out a very general question to the both of you. I mean, I've learned so much for it, but I think, you know, if anything, you know, COVID-19 really puts the humanities at the forefront. That's what I've felt for such a long time now over this year, meaning that all these other social, economic, cultural conflicts and tests really of how well our humanity has been going, how much we apply the logic of care, for example, that sort of thing, right? Is this a good, how do we as humanists grapple with this moment? Do you believe this might actually be a good turning point in the world of STEM, for example, for the humanities to make a much more powerful impact than ever before? And if so, how do we do it? I know this is a huge question.
Okay, thank you, John. Sorry, Michael.
No, please,
okay.
you begin.
Sure. Well, I definitely think that you're right, that humanities have been put to the front line. And it seems that, well, in my field, actually, another hat I'm wearing is I'm a scholar of STS. It's called Science, Technology, and Society. And in this field, we don't see science as science itself. Actually, scientific knowledge making is actually a social process. It's a social activity, right? So this is really a time for us to critically assess how these knowledge are produced. For example, like epidemiology numbers, statistical numbers, what do they mean to the society? And actually in the black box, how these numbers are made. And this is what we're trying to really, what we are concerned about. And then but unfortunately, this is in Hong Kong society, perhaps in every society or every culture is different. And in Hong Kong, the society praises science a lot and emphasizes on STEM education a lot, far more important than arts education, right? So this really depends on in what culture that we are talking about. And then in society, in Hong Kong, yes, humanities, we can, well, I mean, in general, we see that the importance of humanities, right? We need to look at the value principles, we need to look at the ethics, right? But actually, unfortunately, in this city, that we see that humanities are still marginalized.
Answer from a very personal perspective. So when the outbreak first began, this is early February, as director of the Center for Chinese Studies, I actually co-organized a panel in conjunction with the UCLA School of Public Health on the COVID-19 outbreak. And most of our panel, we had one law professor, but everyone else was an epidemiologist or an infectious disease specialist. And I felt as a humanist, kind of superfluous. What can I, where's my role here? You just feel helpless. I'm not a frontline worker. I'm not a doctor. And I think a lot of people, maybe in the humanities, but also in any non-medical fields or non-essential care, essential worker fields, are faced with this conundrum of what is my role here? How can I contribute? Especially when so much of what was our quote unquote normal work just feels it's hard to find the relevance, and what's the point of writing an essay about some beautiful novel when people are dying and people are suffering, and there's all of this turmoil and unrest. And so for me, part of my voyage was, how can I use whatever background I have to make it matter, to impact a change, and to make what I do in the humanities more relevant. And I don't think anything else that I've experienced in my career has pushed me to kind of combine more activism and engagement with the real world around me than what I've been experiencing these last few months. The one part of that was translating Fang's diary, donating money to causes that are important to you, studying cultural works that are speaking to the moment and of the moment and can really impact change. Impact is, I think, a real important keyword for me. And I think it's, of course, a crisis, but it's also a possibility for rejuvenation in terms of how we take this crisis, internalize it, and then put something positive to battle all of the darkness and chaos that seems to be around us. I think all we can do as individuals is kind of release as much positivity through our work, through our actions, as we can. But we do need to reevaluate the role of the humanities vis-a-vis this changing world. And that's something I've been kind of internalizing and trying to do, but I think everyone needs to do it on an individual basis.
Yeah, Michael, I really want to thank you for this reflection. And actually, I had similar reflections as well. I've never been a historian of infectious diseases at all. And then suddenly I've been put on the role to speak on a lot of things. But actually, well, I think this is important. In medical humanities, there is a field, illness narratives, that we pay attention to perspectives. And then, for example, like clinicians' perspectives on, for example, after you are contracted a virus and there are clinical stages, right? And this is actually so different from a sufferer's clinical stages. I mean, perhaps COVID mean to them is actually a career change, is the disruption of family doing. And so we really need these voices from different stakeholders in order to better inform clinical decision-making and maybe further policy making.
Harry, one question, a last question here before we close this session from an audience, asking you what you think about how a democratic versus an authoritarian government would be better or worse in handling the crisis, looking at various countries' experience. Just one minute response, please.
Okay, thank you. Right, I can give you my op-ed I wrote for Mingpao. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, I actually wrote one virus and 4 polities. Right, so I can give you the link, and then, but actually, this is after 6 months. The only thing I want to say is that it doesn't matter. It's the society as a whole that we need to pay attention. It's so complex. It's not about democracy and authoritarian state.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would agree that generalization, we want to avoid generalizations. I will make one generalization though. It seems that countries with female presidents and prime ministers have done exceptionally well worldwide in terms of handling the virus. And I'll just put that out there as one positive thing.
Well, it's not a generalization. There are empirical, evidence of that. Anyway, I wish we could really continue with this. Maybe we should have scheduled, this to be a 3-hour conversation. I didn't, because I apologize that, our third speaker could not appear with us. Maybe technical reason or other reasons. But just 2 speakers and your powerful stories to tell and your questions, we really, really thank you. What a great way to open this conference. We have many more conversations to come, so please join us. I apologize for the other audience who we cannot get to your questions, because we do need to close this session now, because we have another session coming on. So once again, thank you so much, Michael Berry and Harry Wu. Okay.
Thank you, John.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.